Yes, I've been meaning to get around to this one. In case you don't know, I have a little bit of history with the YouTuber Hakim. We were both growing our channels around similar times, and I learned about him around the period I was moving towards Marxism-Leninism. Since then, of course, I've moved on, or moved back maybe, and Hakim and his friends have become quite popular within the communist scene. At least the communist scene that hasn't gone full crazy. Regrettably, I must say that my opinion of Hakim has steadily gone down as I've noticed more and more of his arguments have been becoming increasingly dishonest, and much of the time they seem to fall straight into capital P propaganda territory. As an example, in his video on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he fails to mention any of Poland's perspectives, downplays the annexations because they used to belong to the Empire, cherry-picks anecdotes from Poles to show the Soviets as liberators, as if there weren't people who did the same with the Nazis, and probably the most bizarre, claims that there wasn't any intention of occupying Eastern Europe from the Soviet side because the secret section's words are obscured as to hide the Nazis' true intentions, whilst literally showing the text in question, which is clear as day implying an imminent occupation. This sort of stuff hits me on a very personal cringe level. It was this very one-sided scraping together of cherry-picked information, omitting crucial details, and making biased conclusions which I was taking when I made my videos of apologia back in the day, particularly that dreadful one on the DDR. Ugh, awful stuff of which I regret wholeheartedly. A year after I made my video on the word Tankie, I was intrigued to discover that Hakim had made a video on the topic as well, and whilst perhaps appearing profound on the surface, it came across reminiscent of that hollow and slimy narrative creation that I was guilty of.
This is simply Marxist criticism that I can explain in much more detail sometime in the future. I in fact invite the same from our anarchist comrades. Criticism is what drove socialism forward and allowed it to develop.
Very well.
The origins of the term. Originally, Tankie was a term that originated in the British left wing for those that supported the Soviet intervention in Hungary.
The word Tankie has its namesake from Hungary, but importantly, really importantly now, it wasn't just Hungary. As I implied in my video on the topic, but what needs more exemplification, it only grew in traction after the Prague Spring, in conjunction with the rise of the New Left, which led to significantly more controversy within the established communist parties compared to with Hungary. Otherwise, we would have seen more documentation of this word prior. We do not. As far as I can ascertain, this is the first written mention of the word Tankie from the Warwick University student newspaper in 1978. What you have here is not an action, but a pattern of behavior, a trend of influence from the barrel of the gun when things don't go their way. Now, I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but the Prague Spring is rarely mentioned compared with the Hungarian Revolution, and I think there's a very good reason for that, considering it was an even larger scale repression. It gives me the feeling of that classic, focus all of your attention over here with this one thing that we can more easily associate with reactionaries and fascists and whatnot, and then all of those broader trends over there, they can be ignored.
The intervention is a huge topic in and of itself, so take a look at the history of the working class movement in Hungary for a deeper dive. TLDR, it's far more complicated than libertarian socialist uprising or complete fascist takeover. Regardless, neither that Hungarian Republic nor the USSR
hang on. I see what you did there. Look, I'm not asking for an essay here, but your video is only 15 minutes long. I feel it's a bit lazy and underhanded to just throw that out there and then rely on your audience's ignorance to just accept your both sides argument or read a very big, potentially sanctioned book, of which you provide zero insight or page numbers. You've made videos on similar topics. Perhaps it might be a good idea to give a quick summary of it that makes a more debatable point than this South Park-style conclusion.
TLDR, it's far more complicated than libertarian socialist uprising or complete fascist takeover.
That's correct, it wasn't. Neither was the Paris Commune a load of anarchists running around. In both situations, there was no unifying program of agendas or strategy. It was a mixed bag of many different people with all sorts of various ideas and beliefs. But what connected them, and what it represented, is a clear, wide-scale level of discontent from the ordinary people. We want something better. That can't simply be ignored because there might be some bad people who also had grievances. And why did they have such grievances? Largely because they had been being rinsed by the Soviets for reparations, something that the Bolsheviks, by the way, opposed 30 years prior. This resulted in huge hardship and alienation for the Hungarian working class, who had to labor away for less and less whilst living in fear of their doorbells. This might make us question the standards and interests of those in power versus those who had to toil under them, quite like we do in Western capitalist societies. Now, the gist of this book and the article that Hakim has in the background by PSL, seriously? Do the typical sort of middle ground row, but always hold a positive claim on the Communist Party beforehand. The revolution was headed by reactionary elements, but the core of the people involved in the revolt were just commonplace people who were being misled. So in other words, the standard party line. Very convenient. Well, the powers that be need to justify their position. They don't just suddenly get a free pass because they're labeled communist. What matters is what works for us, not just adhering to dogma. What makes me raise an eyebrow about this book, though, and its credibility, is the date of publication and the fact that it's been translated from Hungarian. As I alluded to earlier, this book might well have been officially sanctioned. So in other words, not exactly an objective source. You also can't find any other reference to it outside of the Internet Archive.
What people mean. Nowadays, the term Tankie is mostly used by people, some which claiming to be leftist, while others clearly not, to refer derogatorily to... Well, here's where it gets a little more complicated. There are a few targets. Number 1, in the narrowest possible definition, Tankies are those that are more or less partial to the experiences and lessons of former socialist as well as current socialist examples, as well as their leaders, for example the USSR, Cuba, Vietnam, etc. Number 2, slightly broader, a Tankie is anyone who...
Hakim lists the usual lowbrow interpretations of what people happen to be irked with, yet there's no attempt made to link what these differing criticisms might be pointing towards. I know you watched my video on the topic, buddy. Do you have any problems with that point? The patterns people referring to, in good faith or not, revolve around the ideological roots that form the branching logics. One of the reasons for me drifting away from right-wing libertarianism over a decade ago is because of all of the vulgarities which kept on cropping up. Even though I was drawn to the more liberatory words and beliefs, open borders, freedom of speech, small government, why did it always seem to attract so many nasty characters who seemed completely anathema to those ideas? What I would have to come to terms with is that it was the very ideological interests which promoted such behaviors and attracted such people in the first place. Why do these traits and behaviors occur in some more than others? If there is a good reason to stop using the word tankie, it's because it makes you attack a vibe as opposed to the core fundamental of what you're trying to criticize. You can always say, oh, but they're the good ML. But even the best ML will always hold more or less the same core lines as the most unrelatable. They just don't need to be so vulgar because they exist within a world of more entrenched believers. So yeah, sure, use Marxist-Leninist. It cuts straight to the point of what you're going for. Still, from an analytical point of view, it doesn't mean that we can't notice certain behaviors. I found Paul Mattick's observations on the New Left quite insightful, and how it might give answers to why so much of Western tendencies are so weird. This is from the 1970s, by the way. Notice how comparable it is for today's world. Although its proponents trying to differentiate themselves from the old and discredited labor movement, they have not as of yet been able to evolve a theory and practice of their own which could be considered superior to those in the past. In fact, the lessons of history seem to be largely wasted on the new generation, which often merely repeats in a more insolent fashion and with less sophistication the proven mistakes of the past. Instead of finding their orientation in the actual social conditions and their possibilities, the new leftists base their concerns mainly on a set of ideologies which have no relevance to the requirements of social change in capitalist nations. They find their inspiration not in the developmental processes of their own society, but in the heroes of popular revolutions in faraway countries. thereby revealing that their enthusiasm is not as of yet a real concern for decisive social change. So what Paul is getting at here is that there's this sort of hipster weeboo trend of people emulating styles without substance. If there was substance, there'd be a threat. They're not. Language is also an inherently funny thing, and just because there might be ambiguity doesn't mean that there isn't some core that we can make sense of. To illustrate this far better than I ever could, here's a popular section from a lecture by the late Michael Sugrue, perhaps better known as the chair question.
Imagine someone that had spent, a scholar, spent his entire life trying to figure out what it is that makes beautiful things beautiful. And he looked at Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, he looked at Rembrandt's portraits, he looked at the Sistine Chapel, he looked at a number of things, and racked his brain for a whole career, 20, 30, 40 years, trying to figure out some quality that all these things have in common. And the difficulty may be in the kind of question that we're asking. They may not have anything intrinsically in common that unites all of them. There may be a series of overlapping commonalities that allow us to refer to all these things in a rough and approximate way. It doesn't give us ultimate Platonic precision. It won't turn us into logic machines. But the demand for final logical precision may be the problem here rather than the fuzziness of our language. It may be that we're making impossible and unreasonable demands when we ask for the form of the chair, for the essential quality of every chair and only chairs. Perhaps what we need is a series of examples that work in a rough, practical way in the language games that we live with. In other words, the fact that I can't specify for you some quality that every game has and only games have doesn't mean that you don't know what I'm talking about when I use the word game, and doesn't mean I can't teach it to Johnny. And what more do you want to do with it? How do we know when we really understand something? Maybe Johnny is going to go out and misuse the word later on, and there's an intrinsic ambiguity to defining things by example. That is to say, there's always going to be an uncertainty when you get to the peripheral examples of a game or a chair or anything else as to whether this falls under the rubric chair or game or not. Is a doll's house chair a chair? Well, maybe. Is a throne a chair? Well, I guess. If you sit on a boulder, is that a chair? Well, Wittgenstein says the problem is not with our language, the problem is not with our thinking, the problem is with the demand for absolute certainty about the nature of chairness. There is no such thing. There's just this chair and that chair and the other chair, and there's an intrinsic ambiguity built into our definitions along those lines that's exactly like the ambiguity that we find in a fuzzy photograph.
If you try hard enough, you can literally do this with anything. I'm sure you can think of a time in which this word has come into contention, whether it's the specific defining of what constitutes exactly who is proletarian, or contemporary liberal pundits claiming that the word is outdated in light of the expansion of the economy. But such pedantry over the word ignores the point of why it exists in the first place, to help us better understand the evident reality of class society. Or what about this one? The more I ponder addiction, the more I realize that it's a lot more open to interpretation than I thought. If I take cocaine once a week, does that make me an addict? Does drinking once or twice every day after work make me an alkie? What about democracy? Despite all of these complexities that might arise, we can still figure out meaning within them, so long as we're not being pedantic for our own biased reasons. There really seems to be a blockage of intrigue when Marxist-Leninists are faced with this word, something that, as we'll see, is none too uncommon.
It's supposed to mean someone who uncritically supports everything a socialist nation does. These people don't exist. The USSR or China or Stalin did nothing wrong is a meme set online as a joke. No one actually believes it. Likewise, seeing someone saying something on Twitter and interpreting that opinion as representative of the entire movement is silly. In my personal experience, you won't ever see a more critical and nuanced view of, for example, the USSR, than from someone who has actually taken the effort to properly study that system, usually a well-read Marxist-Leninist.
And as a Turkish nationalist, I've found that members of such happen to have the best critiques of Kemal Atatürk. I mean, come on! If I've caused some confusion in my previous words, let me be clear. When I say that Marxist-Leninists support critique, that's not to say that they don't critique at all. If I have said that, I apologize. Anybody can offer critiques. You can even point out serious errors made by those in power, but it doesn't make those critiques automatically valuable. I'm sure you've often noticed when examining the views of those who don't align with your own, the critiques from hardliners tend to be very superficial. They usually lack a genuine desire to explore new territories, and instead focus solely on maintaining their established beliefs. Whilst you might feel from your perspective that MLs are giving a strong critique, from a recovering one's perspective, it's really not all you think it is. Now, to demonstrate this, here's a word that Hakim uses a fair bit, which I've been getting a little bit tired of.
Nuance, a nuanced view, nuances, some nuances, nuances. There's always more nuance to be had.
It's become a very popular term in recent years, yet I wonder if a lot of the people who keep saying it actually understand what it refers to. I don't know, the way Hakim pushes it around all the time just seems like a bit of a cliché. Nuance, in the simplest terms, simply refers to subtleties, i.e., nothing is black or white, but various shades of grey. It's important to understand the subtleties of complex subjects as to form a broader and richer perspective on history. And let's be honest, basic bro interpretations of history are often boring and repetitive. But despite all of the nuance that you can find about him, I think we'd all agree that Hitler wasn't a very nice man. What I'm getting at is that highlighting the nuance of something doesn't prove anything alone as to whether it's right or wrong. It just helps us understand that there's more to it. You have to then use that information to figure out conclusions from the complexities and the murkiness. A nuanced depiction of the Reich might be to understand them as not uniquely evil, but something that everybody could potentially fall into. This is the perspective which is becoming more popular today in comparison with the Hollywood-influenced supervillains archetypes, with the West as the noble saviors. A perspective that would not be nuanced would be the same route that folks like David Irving and his litters take and intentionally mislead people because of their personal biases. This is not nuance, it's negation. The common assertion that Stalin tried to step down from his position 4 times might appear nuanced, but your interpretation of that situation also matters. When MLs use this line, they normally just stop there, with the implication that how could Stalin have been all-powerful if he had to be kept in power? They don't ask basic questions like whether or not he was lying, trying to consolidate power like other Russian leaders have historically done. That's what historians are interested in. Not the what, but the why. Often in these discussions where people claim to be speaking brave, unheard truths might miss the fact that there's already been plenty of nuance made. It's just not the nuance that you like, or the conclusions that you agree with. J. Arch Getty is a historian on Soviet history, most famous for his nuanced revisionist take on the purges, not as a blind takedown of anyone they didn't like, but rather an internal cleansing of party members in fear of a potential overthrow that they didn't like. MLs, however, cherry-pick Getty's words to present the purges as justified and or tolerable, much different from Getty's own conclusions. A younger Michael Parenti did this in Black Shirts and Reds, trying to downplay the incarcerations. If you look at just any random page on this citation, you can clearly see that Getty paints a very different picture. Typical negatory strategy, as I've said before, is attacking an established faulty narrative with an equally faulty one. Douglas Tottle, from Fraud, Famine and Fascism fame, does this in the introduction of his book, attacking Western narratives but ignoring that his own narrative is propagandistic in nature. Tottle also cites Getty. Just a bit of trivia, from what I've heard, Getty doesn't actually engage with communists these days for these exact reasons. He doesn't at all enjoy the sliminess of people using his name as an authority to boost one's argument against what his results were. As you can see, all actual roads within that nuance will eventually lead you somewhere, and getting people to gloss over those paths by just insisting, well, you know, there's some nuance, serves the purpose of just justifying your own narrative by proxy. Later in the video, Hakim will say this with regards to the required necessities.
You can disagree with the collectivization of agriculture in the USSR, for example, but that disagreement only means something when you understand the material conditions that gave rise to the necessity of that change in the first place.
Does highlighting historical necessities prove that something was justified? I would say no. The state might have had a required necessity to collectivize. The people who had this thrust upon them did not. They just wanted to live their lives. I mean, how far do we take this? You can disagree with the Berlin Wall, but that disagreement only matters when you understand the material conditions that gave rise to the necessity of that wall in the first place. Necessity for whom? You can disagree with the anti-Deutsch movement, but that disagreement only matters when you understand the material conditions that gave rise to the support of Israel. You can disagree with Enver Hoxha, but yeah, okay, you get the point. I plead on people not to get into the trap of the, ironically, binary choice of nuanced introspection from Marxist-Leninists and nothing but lies and slander from everywhere else. There are plenty of people, myself included, who do not enjoy these mainstream narratives that we see thrown about all the time, but also don't just jump ship into Soviet or anti-imperialism TM defenses. Call Me Steve does a lot of extensive research on the Cold War, particularly East Germany, but you can tell in his words that he's clearly not an apologizer for the system, nor is he doing a both sides. He's simply interested in the truth and how this might influence your take on our present state of affairs. Look at how he presents the Stasi.
Where's the cheese?
It's under the sauce.
There's no cheese on it.
It's under the sauce.
Like, I'm Italian and this is hurting me.
It's from Chicago.
But it's just sauce.
The cheese is under the sauce.
Now, in ML discourse, it might have just stopped there, and despite all of the things that we know that the Stasi did and what they represented, just conclude that that is enough to justify them. But instead, Steve takes a deeper dive and actually comes to some worthwhile conclusions within that nuance.
The Stasi built a lot of their reputation on myth and the idea that they were everywhere. The numbers show that the Stasi weren't as numerous as they wanted people to believe and as we thought. But with the small amount of people, they were able to create a very repressive police state. And from there, they committed terrible crimes against the East German populace. But everything they did wasn't enabled by the fact they had tons of people, or they had super secret agents, or they had abilities that other people did not have. What they did have was the permission of the state to act as they did.
Those words speak to a genuine desire to ask why, instead of just accepting things as they are. Another might be Noj Rants, who presents some really broadened perspectives on socialist history, normally regarding the Russian Revolution and various ML-dominated narratives. It's good stuff, whilst again never drifting into reactionary history or territory. I also like Abby Heffer's nuanced takes on authoritarianism. You can disagree with her politics, but she's providing a much more fruitful perspective that is helpful. I'd much rather have a conversation with her than some stuffy Marxist carbuncle any day. I'm also gonna bet good money on burn these books. But if you're watching, please make your graphic design style a bit more variable. In my own life, I remember an Aussie friend of mine talking about her personal experience when the wall came down. She told me that her perspective and that of her family's was not this joyful escape that is often shown in the media, but rather one of apprehension. After all, the common reaction up to that point was very much in public consciousness. Others might have been genuinely uncertain for the future, their careers, their livelihoods, their savings, and so forth. Other perspectives I've come across actually indicate that a large number of those opposing the DDR were not against the idea of socialism, but rather against the party and their apparatus, which didn't allow for such avenues to come about, including Wolf Biermann. And something that you may have come across is the truth that many East Germans, even those who are not party members, reported living perfectly normal lives. That's an interesting observation, isn't it? Now, the conclusions you can make from that might be, people today also report living perfectly normal lives despite clear and visible distress in our society. What might this tell us about how people can hedonically normalize themselves even under surveillance states? What might this tell us about those on the margins of society and those within accepted society who didn't rock the Casper? Or, well, there were people who liked the DDR actually, so stop writing it off as a hellscape and talk to those people who had a great time. I know which one I'd rather take. Those testimonies are more interesting, and they provide a more accurate view about the world that we live in. which is what I'd argue a lot of people want and are seeking. It's helpful. What is not helpful is the constant hijacking of this desire by the sympathetic sliminess masquerading as nuanced critique from Marxism-Leninism. Let's just call it what it is: a defense. An individual can call for nuance of a very well-known event, in this case it's the deportations, but when it comes time to present your nuanced introspection, it's that Weasley red herring from Grover Fur again. Just the other day I came across a creator moaning about how people accuse them of idealizing the USSR for just pointing out nuance. And then that nuance is just repeating the Kulak excuse with little to no desire for further introspection. Yes, this is a trend. I'm fed up with being told otherwise. If you say that you are interested in nuance, you wouldn't just stop when it fits you. When I was writing my Kronstadt script, I came across that anti-Semitic letter, and I had to make a decision whether I would ignore it or I would take this new evidence on board. I took the latter, and I'd wager good money that a lot of people who are interested in this topic would also be fine admitting to it, because it's not a hill we need to die on. So with that in mind, please be understanding when I say that I remain skeptical with Marxist-Leninists on nuance and critique.
A good point to note is that if we're using the term against people who recognize the achievements of former socialisms and adhere to more or less orthodox theoretical approaches to socialism, meaning Marxist-Leninist ones, then this term is a little more than, hopefully, an unintentional condemnation of third world or imperial periphery leftists. The vast majority of active leftists globally, the ones agitating for socialism, are people who identify with Marxism-Leninism or an adjacent offshoot, who recognize and respect the lessons of former socialist experiments, are usually part of Marxist-Leninist parties, and uphold figures that symbolize the revolutionary socialist movement. In essence, the vast majority of the global left would be Tankie in that case. What does that say about the so-called non-Tankie Western left, though? Isn't it at least a little infantilizing and Eurocentric to consider that only the West has it right, meanwhile the vast majority of historic as well as modern revolutionary leftists had it entirely wrong?
Now, if Hakim is pointing here to how so many people would also be considered tankies in the global south by the same logic that people use the word here, then yes, maybe there is some truth to that. This is in part a somewhat good critique of Tankie, but this is where my approach makes the discussion somewhat irrelevant. My conclusion to that would simply be to say, yes, they're Marxist-Leninists, and I disagree with them. The prevalence of Marxism-Leninism across the world isn't enough by itself to warrant some gold star of relevance. Like I've said before, this is survivor bias. The survivors took their ideology, and that is now what we see in the present day. Destroying and getting a leg over other ideologies, and then proudly professing that yours obviously has merit by dint of its pervasiveness is not the win you think it is. Nor is some people exhibiting Eurocentrism a validation of an ideology's correctness. People of the global south are not a hive mind, as I'm sure you'd agree. Many of you might be surprised to hear that in Indonesia, anarchism is one of the most popular radical currents, maybe even surpassing Marxism. Ooh, that's a surprise. Now, if I was going to be very, very charitable, I could make the case that this is partly due to the communists being purged regardless of tendencies during the 60s by right-wing death squads. For the purposes of this discussion, they were, in a sense, the survivors, maybe. Doesn't give anarchism a black star of relevance just because they're the most popular. Nor would I say that if it were more popular in other countries. I do just also want to highlight the common claim made for many, many years, and I'm guilty of that too, I'm not counting myself out on that, the idea that anarchism is a white Western ideology. And that's just not true. The ideas are what matters, and ideas can be intercontinental.
Likewise, the term seems to apply selectively. Those with incredibly similar beliefs and approaches may get the label on them, or not usually based on the level of demonization in common anti-communist American media, or based on how much that particular individual likes said figure. Concretely, Sankara and Castro aren't too different from Kim Il-sung or Honecker.
So your implication here, if I read it correctly, is that if the sexy socialists are on the same level as the ugly socialists, then you ought to treat the latter like the former or something like that. My conclusion, if that were true, is that's not going to be the hill I seek to die on. I'll look into those figures, but I'd maybe use that information to find better solutions. Because guess what? You do not need to stop at Kim and Honecker. Why not Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania? Or Mengistu, the leader of the Derg in Ethiopia? Are you going to bring nuance to them as well? Look at how far this gets you.
On authority.
Oh, we know where this is headed.
Another point usually tied into Tankie discourse is the idea of authority or authoritarianism. Before getting into it, the term is also incredibly nebulous. Between dictionaries and various quote-unquote respectable encyclopedias, you get several incredibly broad or contradictory definitions. As with totalitarianism, it's more of an invented political term, used in attempts by particularly American academia to lump fascism with socialism.
You know, I'm going to hit back on this one, actually. Yeah, sure, a lot of liberal discussions, it is thrown around as a cliche. But I feel, if anything these days, the reductified perception of this word by Leninists has become the new cliche. Because within those that have good intentions is actually a very good starting point for understanding where the distribution of power lies. I wonder if people like Hakim are just saying this because criticism of authoritarianism is damaging to their foundations.
For the liberals in the crowd, name something you dislike about authoritarian socialist governments, and a government model you look up to or believe is viable to reform has most likely done the same at some point to differing extent.
Yes, Hakim, they do. But this is an argument against liberalism, not against socialists. The "and you are lynching Negroes" line at best simply brings the two sides on the level. And that's it. They do it too, so why are you picking on us? What's being critiqued here is the authoritarianism, and any self-proclaimed socialist should be against those actions. Marxist-Leninists do not do this. That is the critique. Thankfully, though, Hakim does present a leftward critique, but he does it in this gish-gallopy way that seems really vague and uninterested. Let's have a look.
Likewise, to anarchist listeners, every prior example anarchists uphold had exclusive access to and use of arms, had labor discipline, an internal security apparatus, a system of prisons which included political prisoners, a hierarchical bureaucracy, exclusive control of sources of media, conscription, I could go on.
Hakim never cites anything here, and like I said, it's a gish gallop, so I don't feel I should expend my energy going through each individual claim. Instead, I want to go straight to the point of the transformation question. What matters for us looking back is if the anarchists would have been able to have overcome those challenges once peacetime had emerged, and how we might interpret them, if they continued to do so as did the SSSR, or if they managed to enable a path for something better. With regards to all of these technicalities, is the anarchist zeitgeist of today defending such actions, like the Leninists do with their respective revolutions? Or are they thinking about alternatives that could be done, analysis for how such problems emerged, and how best to solve them? You may not realize this, but during the Spanish Civil War, the CNT made one of the most derided actions in anarchist legacy, namely colluding with the Popular Front government. There was a material condition as to why this was done. They were low on arms, and the government wielded the bargain. But of course, that doesn't make it a good decision, or a necessary one. It's an action widely rejected by the current anarchist milieu, and even the rank and file of the contemporary era. It resulted in numerous contradictions forming between the rank and file and new leadership, as well as a weakening of the overall movement, to the point where the May Days happened. Again, anarchists are not going, oh, well, they had to do it, they had no choice. No, they are looking at it critically and saying, no, we could have done better. In fact, many might view the experience in Spain, including myself, as a reason for why syndicalism might be flawed. That it leads to reformists growing, that the focus on work instead of other relevant topics might create new issues, and that unions in and of themselves aren't revolutionary. The experience of the Free Territory in Ukraine led to an expansion of anarchist thought, platformism, but this was in turn criticized by Malatesta and Volin, who considered such a practice as contradictory to the aims of the movement, as it did not allow for individuals to further develop alternate currents, that it would just lead to a new vanguard with extra steps. There are many anarchists who reject the idea of democracy as far as we see it, not from a reactionary angle, but rather one of insufficiency. And in the time since then, some anarchists are so left-wing that they don't even consider themselves left-wing anymore, and have a completely ruptured current from mainstream anarchism. Whatever your thoughts are, you just do not see this wealth of criticism when it comes to Leninism. or even a lot of orthodox Marxism, to be honest. On the contrary, they basically defend every action Lenin did as necessary. Perhaps this speaks to the critical nature of the two ideologies. There are no Makhnovists these days. There are people who will look at their example and see a formation that is distinctively different from the Bolshevik party structure. They will ask, does that hold up with our principles, that we need to balance our ends in tandem with our means? Let's build an idea from the ground up that can fight these contradictions. In fact, you'll notice that all anarchist tendencies are named after their strategy and ideals, not the beliefs of one person. And I think this speaks to the rigidness of such a tendency upholding the legacy of bad actions, compared with one that is more than happy to move on and allow room to adjust its fundamentals in light of new information. So, is what Hakim is implying here that an anarchist state could emerge in a future anarchist example? Yes. Let's make that clear for all of the sound bites and cherry-picked quotes that I know I'm going to get. Yes. It's very possible that a group utilizing a more populist definition of anarchism, like unjustified hierarchy, might end up reproducing the effects of a state authority, justifying oppression in the name of necessity. Even before the Rojava Revolution became mainstream, anarchists from the most reputed journals and newspapers were giving strong skepticism. I remember it at the time, actually. The point is to fight against it, even if it happens to be your chosen tendency. If I, for example, Bad Mouse, became the big cheese, I don't care what arguments I would be making then. I wouldn't want people to be defending me, making a personality of me, making excuses for all of my issues. I would want people to fight against me, pull me down from my high horse, upholding the world that we would want. Because for whatever the follies of human men, the core anarchist critique and understanding of the state, and power in general for that matter, still stands. And you need to provide answers to it that don't just result in an appeal to human nature or fatalism. That critique will always be there. It's really no wonder to me why so many of these parties are so divorced from ordinary people. Whilst anarchists always seem to be eager to put their plans into action and learn and adapt, I think it comes down to the fact that I've said multiple times, anarchists really don't have that many hills they're willing to die on. After a while, you can be happy to just admit and move on. And even if some don't, the ideological underpinnings allow for those people to flourish. It has been said that it's very difficult to remain dogmatic in a tendency whose very premise is, can it be done better? By comparison, Marxism, Leninism, and Trotskyism are just stuck in the past, trying to stay relevant in an ever-changing world where all of their examples resulted in capitalist restoration.
It seems the only successful socialist attempts at building something tangible gets this authoritarian label thrown on it.
Highlighting authoritarian practice that occurred in these examples is always quite sour when presented from MLs. They've already doubled down on it and indentured unconditional submission and discipline into the core of their matrix. So if there's one instance of authoritarianism, there might as well be 100. And now they think they've won ideology points for saying, oh look, but you did it too. Anarchists are rejecting the defeatism of this pathway. They're not giving up on their core critique. They are actively working to improve their means and bring them more in line with their ends.
Any genuine leftist would like nothing more than community control. The thing is, after a revolution, and a civil war, and a reactionary former landlord to fascist movement, foreign sabotage, internal spying, fifth columns, and you end up with a strong centralized state, with a highly developed internal security apparatus, and more restrictive ideas on certain forms of expression.
That is a presumption defined after the fact. I've gone over this in part 2 of my previous video, but to put it mildly, the ideology you take up influences the system you end up building as much as the threats you have surrounding you. You can compare the initial formations as long as they lived and analyze whether they would have resulted similarly. And none of this necessitates or validates Marxism-Leninism. It's simply the ideology that managed to influence the most. It does not speak towards its caliber. Again, I am rejecting this fatalistic interpretation of state formation.
The history of the 20th century paints a very clear picture. Socialism is the way forward for the actual majority of humanity, and reform has been proven a failure time and time again. This leaves us with revolution as the only viable option.
So capitalism bad, reform impotent, revolution therefore the only way forward. Okay, agreed so far.
Which likewise mostly occurred as a result of a party constituted from the working class with sufficient political will and the support of the people. The work of said party and the mass of the population may, we hope, culminate in revolution and the seizure of state power.
Why? See, this is where the conjunction happens. All of your prefigurative efforts are simply based on achieving state power, of which afterwards you will simply control all of the systems of oppression that were in effect before, instead of generating new ones from below. They seem to ignore that such efforts might well induce further antagonisms. You can point and laugh at anti-state leftists all you want, but your arguments against them are always based around presupposing the state, of which they are not. Yes, it's very hard to do things the way a state does when you don't have a state. This is not an idyllic dream. It's a difference of perspective. One is wanting to emancipate the people, the other is wanting the people to emancipate themselves. One thinks that the projects emerge from the organization, the other thinks that the organization forms from the individual projects.
Logical to assume, based on the historical image, that once state power is seized, that fledgling nation will require all sorts of new organizations to protect the new gains of the working class, an internal security apparatus, a military of some size, or nuclear weapons, or something similar. Certain levels of oppression against reactionary sections of the population, landlords, former capitalists, fascists, etc. This will take the form of prison or re-education, or possibly even more severe measures if necessary, for example in the case of counter-revolutionary terrorism, as occurred to various extents throughout socialist history. In the messy post-revolutionary period, it's also logical to expect excesses, although they are undesirable and should be limited to the maximum extent.
For all the exaggerations, the USSR and China still caused enormous death tolls and travesties by the actions of those in charge. I think those are the things that are more interested than a few so-called excesses, and they are not to be understated. 700,000 party people were killed as a result of the purges. Not all of those people are going to be bad guys. So are those just excesses? Are these mistakes? If you're willing to just stop there and write that off as a mistake, then you're not filling me with much confidence for the future. Especially if you say, yes, that was bad, but it had to happen. This is showcasing the sort of bars that you're setting for your ideology. Despite over 500,000 people being killed, all to prevent corruption and capitalist roaders, by ML narratives, within 20 years the USSR had signed its death certificate. So much for Allende and Sankara being too lenient on reactionary elements. Oppression didn't save the USSR, did it? The inevitability from this, then, is that even more people need to be shunned every few decades in order for your system to function. That is not a world I would want to build and or live in. Perhaps if you look at the sheer scale and general indifference to human life, this might be a sign to question whether the roots and the apparatus that you've built up is the cause of these consequences, not small errors that just need a few policy changes. This is why authoritarianism doesn't work. You're always one purge away from success. If I had to give a charitable interpretation of an excess, then it would probably represent something akin to individual elements righting wrongs and outbursts of anger against certain institutions. This is what occurred in the Spanish Civil War against the Catholic Church. And in terms of state power, actually, I'd probably include the excesses of the Cuban Revolution too. Short-lived, relatively small-scale explosions of chaos and confusion during pressing times, normally committed by individuals. Now, like I said, that is not what happened within the USSR. It was a prolonged process of very widespread repression that went on for decades.
Does that make all of this right? Maybe not, but you can see why it would be necessary.
If you have a state. Necessary if you have a state. And now we get to what we all knew was coming.
Give Frederick Engels on Authority a read.
Hakim is recommending On Authority. I really must say, Hakim, this is a very low bar from you. You mentioned at the beginning the word Tankie has been
expanded so much as to be meaningless.
and now here you are promoting an essay in which the author stretches the word so broadly it becomes meaningless. Something I find of note in the on-authority debate is how arguments against authoritarianism are never tackled on the terrain of those making the claim. They only ever just tend to go after some vague misunderstanding of it, insist that their reductive definition is correct, and then just repeating it again and again and again. Like literally, it's all the same. Hakim's podcast partner's Second Thoughts video on the topic basically just makes the exact same point. It's like there's a complete ignorance that the main contention here is Engels' definition is wrong. It's not grounded in how social formations form and function. His points have been responded to numerous times. Why are MLs so adverse to engaging with those criticisms? So, whilst writing this, I came up with an idea. Here is my challenge to the deprogram, because I wish that I had someone force this down my throat authoritatively. Go through a critique of on authority, because like I said, there are plenty. Here's just one. And then try and engage in as good faith as possible you can with the arguments that come up. Explain why you think they're wrong, instead of just repeating Engels saying, "Have these people seen a revolution?" again and again and again. It's boring. Would such people be interested in engaging in many of those critiques, and as Hakim states,
doing the fucking
or
reading?
would they rather just enjoy to go after some low-hanging fruit? It's an observed trend. A test of the integrity of your ideology is whether you choose to jump in the deep end. If your ideology is so thorough, why must such people go after quite weak arguments instead of the strongest ones in order to prove themselves right? Now, Hakim will go over the anti-American angle in this next section, the main problem of which I've highlighted in my ML defeatism video, so we'll move on to the conclusion. And in his conclusion, Hakim states this.
If you don't understand a particular perspective, ask why, dig into things. Simplistic answers are no answers at all, and there's always more nuance to be had.
As I've gone over before, this isn't particularly honest, is it, Hakim? Later you will state,
Much more important is the value of learning from former socialist experiments rather than simply dismissing them, as well as understanding the nuances which lead to the decisions they took.
Yet when you present the so-called faults of socialism, you make absolutely no effort to investigate whether there were serious root causes endemic to the chosen system, rather saying that we should just use the same model but make a few changes here and there. It comes across as, yes, you can make a critique, but only one that fits my ideological standpoint. As it so happens, many of us have analysed the former experiments and come to very different conclusions. Hakim might claim,
Arguing from that wasn't real socialism, that was just Tankie's, makes you look ridiculous as you give the enemies of socialism ammunition against the whole movement in the propaganda war, which the left has far less resource-wise in fighting.
I could argue that supporting AES legitimacy gives them ammo too, because it's flawed and results in numerous silly defences and biases that you have to adhere to. I do not think that taking a very biased campist side is going to be a particularly useful strategy. For an ideology which Hakim states adherents are so critical of in all aspects, why are fundamental concepts, such as democratic centralism, never given that treatment? Have you noticed that? Democratic centralism is always just presumed as the greatest organizational model. No effort is ever made to consider whether this is actually accurate in the decades since. It doesn't really take much more than a cursory glance to see how the form of democratic centralism might induce further issues and sabotage. But a good example for explaining the pitfalls might be the Black Panther Party. Many of the critiques of the Panthers focus around the formal structure of the group, allowing wreckers to sneak in and cut off the head of the hierarchy. When splits occur, when leadership gets destroyed by the authorities, the org goes down with it. To defend the group, things like purges, party discipline, and bans on fracturing are brought in. But these solutions only give way to further contradictions. So rather than simply using the same organizational method, what might be some better ways to solve the problems that the Panthers faced? Instead of purges and vertical decision-making, which only induces paranoia and rigidity, consider practicing basic security culture, making security a natural process whereby people can learn self-discipline and educate themselves instead of needing to be instructed by one single authority. Splits often cause harsh damage to the core of a group, but the main reason for all of the damage that is created is by making it integral to stick together in the first place. Many times such practice can necessitate splits by making it impossible to disagree in any other way. Instead, allow room within the org for splits to become a normal occurrence instead of something that is destructive to the integrity of the group. Rather than pushing leadership up, create recallable and horizontal delegatory leadership, which you might call Hydra form leadership. That way, if the org gets smashed, it can just spring back up in different forms and places. Everybody wants to focus on external contradictions when it's their group involved. But what you must realize is that those contradictions are part of the process you choose. Internal issues enable the activation of external ones. There's always going to be attacks, so how do you form yourself so that such an attack is mitigated? The hierarchy of the Panthers allowed for the government to target figures of interest and damage the organization. Now imagine a situation where there were no such figures, no individual person that has total control over the group. Suddenly, it becomes a lot harder to infiltrate and bring the group down because nobody in particular would significantly wreck it. Evidence has shown that such practice, whilst not perfect, has slowed and weakened the ability for wreckers to thrive. The downside of this practice? Well, you can't seize state power, that's for sure. But maybe you should be asking whether or not that's a good road to go down in the first place. So this is the point of critique. We need to stop just holding up people as a flag that we can just point to and say, hoo-hoo, look, weren't they great? Stop merely interpreting the world and change it. Now, some might say that's utopian. Well, if you choose to take that path, so be it. Continue down your rigid road as you burn out and become irrelevant or reactionary. But for others, some who may well have experienced those challenges firsthand, might choose to learn from it and evolve.
To go through so many changes in my own lifetime, to being open to learning, to come to the conclusion like the Zapatistas that there are no plans, there are no final plans, there is no big R revolution. There has never really been one that has succeeded. But small revolution means that the small people get to make this revolution happen. They bring in their creativity, they bring in their diversity, coming from different places in life. Different experiences, different knowledge bases, means that no one can come and say, well, I got it all. You just got to follow me. You just got to follow our organization. You just got to see our vision. So for me, this Zapatista revolution becomes like what we could have done in the 60s at our height is what the Zapatistas I see doing now, right? Their vision, their style of working with people, how they draw from their own cultures, how they're open to pulling knowledge, information from other areas of the world and all of this stuff, they do. And so I look at the things we did in the Panther Party, and I said, man, I wish we could have done this, I wish we could have done that. Maybe we wouldn't have lost.
The aim of communism is creating the world that we would want to live in. Let me emphasize that, the world that we would want to live in. A classless, stateless, moneyless society. We only get there by creating spaces that can give rise to it. Allow people to be actors in their own self-determination. In a word, prefiguration. And the model which MLs uphold, one of subordination and hierarchy, only prefigures as much as what gets them into power. I'm not saying that guns aren't very good at putting down a system, but I don't think they're particularly good at building a new one. So, that thus concludes my response to Hakim's video, but since I'm still here, I wanted to quickly go over another hang-up I've had with Hakim and others as represented by another one of his videos. So consider this the epilogue segment. Hakim has a video on George Orwell, and how he's a bit of a cunt. Now, if you had to ask my opinion on George Orwell, I would probably say that he's a good writer who wrote some interesting politically themed books. His perspectives on the plight of the working class and his reflections as a man of privilege are very insightful. Like Hemingway, his experiences in Spain are a very good primary source, and showcase a first-hand account of how different things were compared to the Leninist examples. But I'd also say that ultimately his stuff fits in with the likes of Adam Curtis, Howard Zinn, Mark Fisher, baby's first leftist kind of vibes. It's limited by the run-of-the-mill establishment tendencies, and he's certainly no theorist, that's for sure. So, in a word then, in a line, he was a flawed person who's ultimately quite overrated, and maybe not really that worth it compared to other people. This is far from the assessment you will get from MLs. MLs literally want to boil him alive, and it's very much on display in this video. Just like Trotsky, he's a political punching bag. We know this in the selective vigor that MLs spend on him, which isn't showcased towards their own people. Hakim's narrative here is highly sensationalist and selective, with plenty of quote mining to fit, and clutches pearls like a motherfucker. It has been said before, if you're okay attacking Orwell, a man who as far as we know killed nobody and critiqued authoritarian practice, but you rush to the defense of any critique of Stalin or Lenin, whose methods led to the deaths of thousands of innocent people, then you might want to reconsider. It's true that Orwell did sell out a lot of communists to the government. But do you know who also sold out a lot more commies to the government? That's right. Stalin. From 1936 to 41, Stalin sent away hundreds of German and Jewish communists to the Nazis, many of whom had fled to Russia to escape their persecution by them in the first place. He knew full well that he was likely sending them to their deaths, or otherwise their persecution. These were, of course, the communists which Stalin didn't like, and of course because Stalin is the correct communist prior to anything, then obviously the others were wrong. If I wanted to inject nuance here, I could also claim that Orwell was influenced by his material conditions, namely his experiences in Spain, where Stalinists subjected his comrades in arms. Do you think that that might have been a good thing to acknowledge in the name of nuance? No. Hakim never mentioned Spain except insinuating that he never wrote anything against fascism. Bloody hell, man. No matter. Point is, if this is understandable, justified, or otherwise excusable, but Orwell providing a list of reds to the government is enough to sensationalize him as an anti-communist boogeyman, then you are treating him like a punching bag. You do this because Orwell's stance and position is hostile towards your narrative, and so you must find any way possible to throw him down the well. And I go over this example because if you're annoyed at people calling you a tankie, this kind of behavior is not helping your case, is it? So, my challenge to Hakim and the rest of the Deprogram podcast is still there. Give a critique to a critique of On Authority a go. You can do it in any format you want, as a video or a live stream or whatever, and bear in mind the challenge is not to simply do it and then go, okay, mission accomplished. The point is to provide good answers to the points raised in such critiques. And if we're not satisfied with them, then we'll argue some more.